Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Please feel free to let me know in the chat box if you can't. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the Vancouver Humane Society's recently released report addressing animal neglect through the provision of veterinary outreach services. I was so happy to see that so many people are interested in this really important topic, so I'm really excited to connect with you all. Unfortunately, we won't have time to introduce everybody, but I mentioned in the chat box while we're kind of getting started here, feel free to write your name and which organization you're from or any other information you want to share with us. I see some people doing that already. We will go ahead and introduce ourselves though. So my name is Celeste Morales, and I'm the lead researcher at the Vancouver Humane Society. And I had the pleasure of editing this amazing report that Terri has written. So Terri, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Terri Gillis, and I'm the program coordinator for the Mcvitty Fund, which you will learn about later if you don't already know a bit about it. And yeah, I'm just excited to be here and excited to see so many people joining us.
Awesome. Thanks, Terri.
Thank you.
So before we move on, I would like to acknowledge that Terri and I are speaking to you while on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. So that's the Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam nations. And I would encourage you all to also share in the chat box the traditional land that you are joining us from today, since I know we have people in a lot of different places joining us today. And I'd also like to let you all know that you can write any questions that you might have in the chat box just throughout the presentation. So that is separate from the chat box. There's a little questions tab right beside, and they are public questions, so others can see them as well. So yeah, as we're going through the presentations, and if you have any questions that might come up, feel free to leave those there, and we will go through as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. So let's go ahead and just get right into it, get started with an overview of the report. So Terri, if you could talk a little bit about that and also talk to us about what the issue is that you were aiming to address through the research.
Sure. The report was written basically as a means of finding out what gaps exist for structurally vulnerable people and their pets in accessing veterinary care. Often structurally vulnerable people are asked to relinquish or surrender their pets for reasons such as neglect, which is often a perceived situation in some cases. Neglect may be assumed by veterinary clinics and animal shelters, sometimes when an individual has not been able to get their pet to a vet or get the medical attention it needs. Usually this is due to a lack of finances, but also sometimes a person doesn't know where they should take their pet or how to get there. So perceived neglect is different than actual neglect or abuse, which of course I'm not condoning. But perceived neglect is more based on making assumptions about someone because of their circumstance. And so it was important to kind of recognize the differences as well as see what can be done to make it easier for structurally vulnerable people and their pets.
Great, thanks, Terri. And with that as well, could you talk a little bit about why this problem exists in the first place?
The problem exists really, in my mind, for two reasons. One, no matter what, lack of finances will always be a reason, and you're going to hear me say that over and over today, I'm sure. Pet care is very expensive, and emergency pet care even more so. And so that is it can be a huge barrier. The second reason I think the problem exists is a lack of education in staff at vet clinics and animal shelters. Obviously not in a lack of education in what they do and what they do so well, but it's more of a lack of education in working with structurally vulnerable people, which because of their circumstances can be very different than working with non-structurally vulnerable folks.
Right.
Yeah.
So I know with mentioning that term a couple times, structurally vulnerable people, that might be a new term to some folks. So could you maybe explain a little bit more about what structurally vulnerable means?
Sure. Structurally vulnerable, sort of as defined, focuses on social and systemic structures and conditions and processes that create barriers to services, whether it's health services, food services, or income resources. The term structurally vulnerable puts the emphasis on the systems rather than the individuals as being vulnerable. So, and by systems, I'm referring to things like the government, for example, where a lot of people depend on their monthly income. So the term structurally vulnerable points the finger at society for marginalizing people rather than at the people for being in the circumstance they're in.
Right.
At one time, not too long ago, the term vulnerable populations was used, but that's been changed because that term makes it sound like the person was vulnerable as opposed to the system that they find themselves in.
Right. So using the term structurally vulnerable is kind of rightfully removing the blame from the person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
And then on that topic of structurally vulnerable people, could you talk a bit about what maybe the specific challenges that structurally vulnerable folks might face?
Sure. I mean, there are many challenges they face, for sure. But the challenges specific to this report are things like lack of finances, but also a lack of empathy and a lack of consideration for their circumstances. So, to give an example of the financial scenario in British Columbia, anyway, individuals who are reliant on government funding, whether it's income assistance, which used to be called welfare, but is now called income assistance, or PWD, which means persons with disabilities, they take home such low earnings that if there's any crisis at all in their life, they likely can't afford to pay for it.
Right.
So when you factor in their best friend, their dog, their cat, their baby rat, whatever, if they suddenly need medical attention, money is an absolute immediate barrier. And then if they delay taking their pet to the vet because they know they can't afford to, then they prolong the suffering of the animal in some cases, which is that perceived neglect that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And by the time they take their pet to the vet, the animal may be in advanced pain or needing more serious treatment than it would have if the person had been able to take them, originally. So what that can create is then judgment that is placed on the pet guardian by the staff of the clinic. I've heard staff say people shouldn't be allowed to have pets if they can't afford to take care of them, right? And that's such a huge concept that has many, many layers to it. It's just not that simple.
It's not that simple. Yeah, right. And I imagine it's for many of the same reasons that you and I have pets, but could you explain maybe a little bit why structurally vulnerable people might have pets and what a pet might mean to them?
Sure. I think there's a couple of layers to that question, and the first layer is that, as you suggest, is they have pets the same reason you and I do. We love them. It's companionship. In the case of a rescue animal, we feel we can offer a better life to the animal.
Yeah.
And all that's the same for structurally vulnerable pet guardians as well. But I think there's another layer that offers the guardian a purpose and responsibility. For a lot of these folks, they may not have family or friends, and their animals provide that at the same time that they know they have to feed their pet and exercise them and socialize them, which offers them purpose that they may not experience if they were isolated on their own, for example. They know that every day they have to get up and feed their animal, exercise their animal. And it also can present an element of socialization for, as they're walking their animal, a stranger may say, "Oh, your dog's really cute," and a conversation can be struck that way, which again may not happen if they don't.
Right. And in my experience talking with folks who have accessed veterinary assistance programs like the Mcfitty Fund with VHS, they've said that they've often rescued pets, sometimes when they know they can't afford it, because they say that they identify with the animals and they just feel the need to help them and couldn't possibly leave them in the situation that they're in.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
Yeah. And then with that, you've mentioned these terms a couple times, but could you explain for somebody on the outside looking in a bit about the differences between neglect and circumstance when it comes to structurally vulnerable people?
Sure. I think it kind of comes down to three things. I think there's biases, judgments, and privilege, unless it's a clear-cut case of neglect or abuse, obviously. So to use an example, and this is, I think this is a good one for checking our own privilege. So if I'm walking down the street and see a person who appears to be homeless and they have an animal sitting next to them, what goes through my head? Do I assume that they're taking care of the animal? Or do I pass judgment that they're asking for money so they can't possibly feed their pet? Or do I assume they give their animal 24/7 attention because they're together all the time? Or do I assume the pet probably doesn't get any attention because the guardian, might be a drug user? So in this example, the circumstance is that the pet guardian and the pet may be homeless, but does that mean the animal is neglected? So that's
right.
It's about how we frame it in our own minds too, right? We can't judge a book by its cover always, right? So
yeah, so knowing that it's really important to continuously challenge our own assumptions in those situations.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yeah. So just shifting a little bit here, but we've mentioned this term a couple times, but let's talk a little bit about what trauma is, in that word of trauma-informed approach, and then what a trauma-informed approach looks like.
Well, to put it really simplistically, this will be a very simple definition, but basically trauma is the response to a stressful event. Okay, so trauma can be caused by things like harassment, assault, bullying. There's any number of things that cause trauma. And for structurally vulnerable individuals, they often experience trauma due to the stress of living in the streets, if they're homeless, or if they're housed, they may have undue stress about living on income assistance, how to pay their bills, fear of homelessness or fear of eviction, if they live in buildings with slum landlords. If they have pets, fear of eviction because they have pets, and what if the landlord decides they can't have them anymore? So there's sort of many different layers of trauma for structurally vulnerable people, and some folks are also impacted with PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is PTSD develops when a person's stress doesn't alleviate, or it gets worse from the initial traumatic event. So if it just keeps piling up, if there's stuff that just keeps piling on top of other stress, then that can become PTSD.
And then there's also other types of trauma like racial trauma and intergenerational trauma as well.
Yeah, exactly. Intergenerational trauma, which is trauma that exists for Indigenous populations as a result of residential schools in the 60s scoop and discrimination and many other things. And of course, colonial biases as a result of white settlers taking their privilege over other cultures. That's all there. I actually heard of a story on the news last night that there's research going on now about racial trauma, which is basically like repetitive discrimination, and that they're finding that racial trauma is now becoming a term that people are using more of, and many people are experiencing it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And then with trauma-informed care, which is sort of the trauma-informed approach that we use for this report, is, again, this is a simplistic sort of version of it, but it recognizes some factors that make it necessary to work with people who have been impacted by trauma. And so there's key principles like making sure a person feels safe when you're working with them, and allowing them to have control of their situation, as opposed to making choices for them or taking over.
Yeah.
It's allowing them to make their own decisions, or helping guide them to make a decision if they're unsure how to move forward, and creating trust. And through trust, you can build a connection, and barriers can be dropped because they feel empowered and validated.
Yeah, so really focusing on choice and control and respect, and also building healthy service relationships that don't involve negative power dynamics that often occur.
Exactly, because for a lot of structurally vulnerable people, they, rejection is something they encounter all the time. They're used to being told, you're not eligible for that, you don't qualify for this. Everything is kind of, or so many things are kind of controlled for them, that it can be very difficult for people to build trust.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So then also on the topic of trauma, let's talk a little bit about how animals experience trauma.
Now there isn't a lot of research about this, but the research that I did find suggests that animals experience trauma in very much the same way as humans. There's evidence that animals experience loss and grief. And so when an animal is separated from their owner, that can cause trauma for them. And that's why so many of our rescues have separation anxiety and behavioral issues. It's a direct result of trauma. And so if you look at an animal who's been surrendered, over and over again, each time that is trauma building on the initial event. And so they can suffer PTSD or re-traumatization just like humans can. So when you think about an individual being asked to relinquish their pet, even if it's in the best interest of the animal is likely to experience trauma on some level, right? And again, of course, if an animal is neglected or abused, I'm not suggesting they stay with the guardian, but I think a lot of emphasis is put on the pet guardian and how they feel when they have to surrender an animal, when in fact the animal's going through many of the same feelings and experiences as the owner would be.
Right. Yeah, so that's a really good example of why this approach is really beneficial for both humans and animals. Yeah. And then another concept that you mentioned closer to the beginning of the presentation that I wanted to go over a little bit more and kind of backtrack to is the concept of one welfare. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. One welfare, the idea of one welfare holds humans at the center of the concept, in that humans have control to make the biggest change. So one welfare considers that every choice that is made has a lasting effect on both the environment and on animals, and also has social implication on animal welfare. One welfare is basically an interconnection between animal welfare, human well-being, and the environment. And it uses, as you can see from the slide, it uses an umbrella approach to help develop interdisciplinary ways of working collaboratively, and sort of how everything merges into one another. So the one welfare approach is a framework that looks at different components that affect us in our lives, and recognizes that every part of our lives affects the other, right? So for example, our socioeconomic situation will impact our environment, which impacts housing and food, which impacts our relationships. So the approach gives the opportunity to reflect on our everyday direct and indirect encounters with
Right.
animals, with the environment, so that we become more aware of how we as humans impact those other areas.
Right. That's great. Thank you for explaining that so well, Terri. It can be a little bit of a confusing approach. I know it was for me when I first heard about it.
Yeah.
So that's great. Let's shift a little bit again and talk a bit about how you gathered the information for this report.
Okay. Well, initially, a survey was done by the Vancouver Humane Society that basically inviting animal agencies, including rescues and humane societies and sheltering organizations. And the survey was to better understand the service delivery when it comes to veterinary assistance. And so the survey was sent out provincially, and 21 different agencies responded across the province of British Columbia. And from that information, I conducted research into the gaps that were indicated, such as the need for more programs for marginalized people so they can keep their pets. And in almost all instances, the agencies that provide assistance programs or work with structurally vulnerable people mentioned there should be more programs so that surrendering a pet isn't the only option. And concerns were also raised that if people were afraid they would lose their pet by bringing them in for treatment, that then they may choose not to bring them in at all.
Yeah, that's something that I've heard as well, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, let's go over what we learned through gathering this information and through this research. So what were the main takeaways and findings of the report?
I think there were definitely a few takeaways that were used to inform the recommendations and best practices for this report. There was a definite lack of research and understanding of animal trauma as it relates to relinquishment and separation of pets from their guardians. And as well, many veterinary clinics didn't know that funding assistance programs are being offered and available to their clients. So, which creates a huge gap. So if I'm running an assistance program but nobody knows about it, then it's not that useful. So letting veterinary clinics know it exists, as well as the clients that you're working with, is super important, right?
Right.
And another takeaway too is kind of a dual one, which is adopting the one welfare approach, as well as a trauma-informed approach, which will allow vet clinics and social and animal service agencies to address both the medical and the behavioral needs of the pets of structurally vulnerable individuals in a much more collaborative way. If the staff of the clinics and agencies are able to understand where the clients have come from, that will be beneficial for the client, which in turn is beneficial for the animal, because staff will have some history of how and why the people walk through the doors.
Right, that makes sense. And then for you, what was the most surprising about the research, Terri?
I think despite the lack of education in trauma-informed care, the majority of staff at veterinary clinics and at animal shelters have endless empathy for the animals that they care for, and for the people as well. And that came as a surprise to me. Just I'm not sure why, but I think it was because of the outpouring of empathy that a lot of people shared. For example, some veterinary clinic staff shared stories, obviously in confidence, but of how they cared for pets beyond the rules of the clinic, and as well sometimes even paid for procedures out of their own pockets in order to save an animal and in order to make sure that the animal could stay with the guardian, which was pretty amazing to hear those stories.
Yeah.
And another surprise, and you mentioned it a bit earlier, was learning how many structurally vulnerable individuals take on multiple animals, therefore, sort of regardless of their financial or their living arrangements. You know, many people I talk to continually move around because they take on more pets, and it's more than their current housing situation will allow, right? So they move to another place that allows 4 cats instead of 3. Yeah. And a number of the clients say the reason for having multiple pets is that they just feel if they can help an animal that's in distress, why not? And they're able to give a good, loving home and life. And I think there's definitely, you know, people equate or can equate themselves to animals who've been abandoned, because sometimes they feel that way. And they just have, you know, huge hearts that have room to take on all these pets, and they would rather have too many pets and risk their housing than walk by a pet and leave it in the street.
Right. Yeah, certainly that's a big part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that an interesting takeaway for you was that some folks who work in vet clinics don't know about veterinary assistance programs. So some people watching might know this, but VHS has a veterinary assistance program, which is called Mcfitty Fund, which Terri runs. So Terri, could you talk a little bit more about the Mcfitty Fund?
Sure. First of all, the name came from, it's named after a cat, Mcfitty the cat. And it's a program that it exists as a result of grants matched by donations, and it's available for low-income individuals to access veterinary care. So low-income, persons with disabilities, seniors who are on old age pension or CPP. It's available to any of those folks, and it's a pretty simple process to apply. We have an online application form that is fairly non-invasive. We don't ask a lot of information. We don't need social insurance numbers. We don't, you know, it's basically what's your story and what's the story for your animal, what's your income, that kind of thing. And so yeah, the application's online, and then obviously sometimes we run across people who can't access computers or aren't able to fill out an application. So then they just phone in, and I help them fill out the application online, or over the phone rather. Yeah.
So once they fill out this form, then you assess the situation? Yeah,
each application is assessed sort of case by case, depending on what the issue is, and what level of care is needed, and that kind of thing. We work with a number of different veterinary clinics who offer discounts as well. So if an applicant has a vet that they like to go to and they've gone to for the whole life of the animal, we're not going to say, oh, we need you to switch to a different vet. We'll work with them with their own clinic for sure. But then if they don't know where to go, we've got clinics that we work with all the time who offer us discounts, and we can sort of send them in the right direction based on where they're located.
Right, that's great. And then could you also talk a little bit about what kind of treatments we do fund?
Yeah, we fund, or the Mcfitty funds medical treatments ranging from preventative care. So things like defleeing or deworming, or sometimes dental cleaning, if it's looking like that's going to lead to, you know, dental surgery down the road. And then up to urgent care, which is, we would consider surgery for, you know, if an animal gets hit by a vehicle, or tears a ligament, or, you know, needs dental extractions. So there's quite a vast array. So it can run from taking your pet in for an exam because something doesn't seem quite right, to, you know, a pretty substantial procedure where we fund a portion of.
Right. And then Terri, what do you find is the biggest challenge with running the Mcfitty Fund? I imagine there are a few.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge again is no surprise is money.
Yes.
Obviously, I wish we could just fund full procedures for every animal that needs help, but the fund isn't that big. So the biggest challenge is trying to figure out how much funding can go to each individual animal in each case. A lot of the bigger things, like a big surgery, can be $5,000. So, even if we're able to contribute $400 or $500 to that, which seems like a lot, in the bigger picture, it can that still leaves a lot of money for the person to come up with, right? But regardless, we're still able to help in some way, which is great.
Right. And then with that challenge, I'm wondering if, and I'm sure again that there is, but is there an aspect of the Mcfitty Fund that is really rewarding to you?
Oh, for sure. I think, it's all rewarding. It's being able to give people assistance so that their pets can stay healthy, right? So that part's very rewarding. It's also really, I find it personally really rewarding to learn about the clients and learn about their situations and talk to them about their pets, and that's, to me, very rewarding. And I think too, it's really great to be able to, and I've had clients say to me, thank you so much. Now I can pay my rent.
Right.
Because otherwise they were going to use their rent to pay for medical treatment for their pet, right? So, and people that the structurally vulnerable people that certainly I've worked with are incredibly resilient and resourceful. And if we give a certain amount, they're able to come up with the rest somehow because they find a way to do it.
Right. And I know since we worked together, you've mentioned to me a couple of times how busy the Mcfitty Fund has been lately, especially since the beginning of the new year. Yeah. So it shows there's definitely a need for these types of programs and funds. Yes. And just as a follow-up to talking about the Mcfitty Fund, I'm going to put a link in the chat to the Vancouver Humane Society's urgent care page, which is on our website, so that you all watching can just look at an example of how a web page could be set up to raise funds for veterinary care. So you'll see that on the webpage, folks who might go on the webpage and are looking to donate, they can go to this page and they'll see the animals that we're currently helping. And there's a little story about each animal, so they can read a bit about their situation, how much money we have raised for each animal so far, and they can donate accordingly if they'd like to. So I just popped the link to that in the chat if you are interested in checking it out. It's just a good example of how a webpage can be set up like that.
That's great. Yeah. And further to that, as I mentioned earlier, the Mcvitty Fund gets donations, which come from a lot of individuals that see posts that Vancouver Humane Society does on Facebook and Instagram. Yes. So we post stories and photos of the animals that we assist. And that's one way the other half of the grants are matched. And that's a really sort of again, an easy way to try and raise money, and it's amazing how generous people are, especially in these times with COVID and with so much insecurity that I think people are faced with, and yet they're still able to donate some money towards someone else's pet, which is amazing.
Yeah, people have been incredibly generous, and the social media definitely does help. It seems like people really resonate with seeing the actual pictures and hearing a more personal story. So that seems to be a really good way to promote the program a little bit. So on the topic of veterinary assistance programs, you might be watching this and maybe you're thinking about implementing a veterinary assistance program, or you have one but you want to improve it, you're not sure where to start. So I'm wondering, Terri, what is your advice for organizations who have not implemented veterinary assistance programs yet? So what are the first kind of baby steps that organizations could take?
I think the key thing to keep in mind is an assistance program can be as small or as large as you're able to make it. For example, starting out with something that isn't even financial is possible, that can help people, such as, you know, if you take in donations of gently used pet accessories like collars and leashes, blankets, beds, bowls, that kind of thing, and have a spot that people can drop them off and then other folks can pick up. That doesn't cost anything, right? So that's certainly assistance for a structurally vulnerable person to not have to go out and buy a leash or a collar. You know, that's money they can use elsewhere. So that is an assistance program right there. But also I think it's becoming familiar with other programs that exist, other funding assistance programs. In case any recommendations can be made that way, rather than reinventing the wheel. Talk to people who already have programs set up. You'll see at the end of our slide presentation, my email is going to be shown, and I'm happy to talk further after this webinar to people if they have any questions or want more information about Mcvitty. Please reach out, and I'm happy to have those talks, and just see what else is available in your area, wherever you are living. Do some research, ask around, call vet clinics, call humane societies, see what already exists, because maybe you don't have to start something, maybe you just need to know about something. But also, I think you can, you know, start small. You could start just with stories and photos on a Facebook page and ask for donations. It doesn't have to initially be, you know, a huge initiative. One thing too, I would love to see more vets do, and some do this, but not very many that I've come across, is to offer a payment plan or sliding scale for people who are lower income. A lot of clinics, you know, you have to pay in full before your animal's released, and that can be pretty challenging. So to have the ability to make payments would be terrific. And like I said, there's a couple of clinics that I know that do that, but I would say the majority do not.
Yeah, that's something I've heard from folks too who have accessed the Mcfitty fund, is the payment plans and the sliding scales. Is something that would be incredibly helpful and fairly simple to implement. So,
and especially because if a pet guardian has a good experience with that clinic, because I think sometimes the concern for the clinics are, what if they don't get full payment? You know, once the pet's released, what if that's the end of that? But from what I can tell from the people I've talked to, is if they've had a good experience at that clinic, that's now their go-to clinic. So they're going to go back there every time there's an issue with their pet, especially if, you know, they like the doctor or the staff, or feel that they and their pet had a really good experience, they will go back again, right? So I think that would alleviate some of the issues as well.
Yeah. Great. Those are some great thoughts, Terri. Thank you. And then what are some examples of the types of practices that folks can start to implement in their everyday interactions with clients in order to kind of start off the shift towards a more trauma-informed approach?
I think a lot of it comes down to treating everybody from a place of respect and non-judgment, and asking a really key question, which is to ask the person what they need so they can keep their pet. And to look at relinquishment as a last resort as opposed to a goal. and talking to people about potential resources, as I mentioned earlier, that can help their pet. For example, in Vancouver, the SPCA runs Charlie's Food Bank, which is a source of free pet food, and I think some other like accessories, collars and leashes and stuff like that for structurally vulnerable pet guardians. And just find out what's already there in your community that you can recommend. I think I know we always say don't make assumptions, but I think one assumption that could be made is to assume that pet guardians want to keep their pet unless they specifically tell you otherwise. So by making that assumption, you're able to speak from a place of equality with the person, and they don't feel like there's ulterior motives, or that they're going to have to give up their pet, or that it'll even come up. Another thing I think that's really important to recognize is language. If language is a barrier of any kind when communicating with a client and staff, something as simple as Google Translate can help. And also, there's lots of terms that are used for when an animal's sick that are hard to understand. And so if English isn't your first language, that becomes an even greater barrier if you're not understanding what you're being told is wrong with your pet. So I think communication is definitely key as well. And then finally, I think to never assume that people can't pay their bill. And when asked how much something's going to cost, be honest about it and answer out of respect and without judgment. Again, like I say, people are super resourceful. I've heard of clients have said to me that they've set up like a GoFundMe style campaign to try and raise funds for their cat surgery or what have you. So, none of the clients I've ever worked with are expecting anything for free. They just usually need some time to get the resources together, right? So I think it's really important to be honest about what's happening and what needs to happen with the pet, and just deal with it on a real equal level.
Right. And then with all of these new learnings that we're talking about, Terri, did the research lead you to want to make any changes in our own organization or with the Mcfitty Fund?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I've been with Mcfitty Fund since May of 2020, so not a huge amount of time. But I know that even since the time I've been here and working on this report, I spend a lot more time speaking with the clients than I did initially. And again, I think that's really critical to gaining trust with a person. And once you're able to gain trust and connection with them, then it's more likely that they're going to try and get help for their pet, even if they're going to, need time to raise some money in that, because by listening to them, by hearing their story, by getting the background of their animals, they feel invested in what they're telling you, and know that it's critical to get help for their animals. So, and that's about building relationships and building rapport.
Yes.
I also try to follow up with clients, although that's getting harder. The busier Mcvitty Fund gets, the harder it is to follow up with clients. But I do try to follow up just to see how the pet's doing, to see how the client's doing, and particularly if I know that they're using a veterinary clinic for the first time, I like to kind of find out what their experience has been and how they felt their animal was treated, how they felt they were treated. And if there's any follow-up to do with the clinic based on their feedback, then that's when that education can begin.
Right. Great. Thanks, Terri. And then, as we know, implementing an organizational change like this can be really daunting. So I'm wondering, what do you think will be the hardest change to implement for organizations in their programming? And then with that, what are some ways that organizations could deal with those difficulties?
I think there's two things. I think there's, again, funding, finances. But I actually think the bigger component, because I think there's funding and time, and I think time is probably, or could be slightly bigger than funding in this particular case. And I'm sure there's people watching and listening who, are going, that's great. You've got 20 minutes to find out your client's history and the background and blah, 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 right? But I realize that time is premium, time is gold. And I know from talking to different shelters and vet clinics how run off your feet you are. So I have to recognize that, because I keep talking about, spending time with clients, right? And I realize that time is of the essence always. And so I think that's probably the biggest component for, and then funding is secondary to that. And so I think if an organization decides to go forward with the program, it's going to be really important to figure out how it's going to work from a time perspective, as much as from a financial perspective, and to know if it's feasible. Because the last thing you want to do is implement something that is going to fall apart after the first month, because nobody has time to deal with it. So I think it's coming up with a plan where, we're super lucky at Vancouver Humane Society, because that's my job. That's my job every day, is to talk to the clients and administer the Mcfitty fund. But if an organization is implementing a program that exists sort of, and all staff are responsible for it, then it's important to figure out what component each staff member is responsible for, or does it switch shift to shift? If one person's shift A and one person's shift B, how does the role, or there's certain hours in the day that people can call in. It's all those things. It's really figuring out the nuts and bolts of the plan to see if it can be implemented. And then if it works time-wise, then I think then the funding is the next step, in terms of raising donations or applying for grants or what have you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for talking about those, Terri. And then another difficulty that often comes up when making an organizational change of this nature is that we have to challenge our own internal and unconscious biases in order to make change. And so I think the next steps that we're taking with this work will really help to allow for that kind of internal shift, along with the practical shifts that you've talked about, Terri. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that just to kind of close off the presentation. So we are continuing on with this important work through a research project that I'm currently working on in partnership with Thompson Rivers University, which is called Taking a Trauma-Informed Decolonized Approach to Assisting Structurally Vulnerable People with Addressing Animal Neglect. So I know that's quite a lengthy title, so I'll break it down a little bit. The overall aim of the research is really to update the program design and the training of staff in the animal services sector. So free to access online training course that has a focus on one welfare and a focus on trauma-informed care will be the outcome of this project. So specifically, we are exploring the best practices in taking a trauma-informed approach in other sectors such as nursing and child welfare. And we're also looking into compassion fatigue and burnout and how those affect the decisions of shelter and protection and animal protection workers. So we're planning to design the course in modules so that it can be used by animal protection agencies, but also we're hoping that some elements will be relevant for veterinary clinics and for social services as well. So we'll be gathering the knowledge for this training course through interviews, so with workers in social work and nursing who currently use a trauma-informed approach, workers in animal protection who have experience with the surrender or seizure of animals, and clients of animal protection agencies who have experienced the loss of a pet due to surrender or seizure. So we'll also be incorporating insights from Indigenous community members and academics. So If you're interested in this project, which is kind of the next step after the report that we're talking about today, and you want to hear any updates about the report and the training program that will be the outcome, you can just write yes in the chat box, or you can email me or something like that, and I will create a kind of mailing list so that we can stay connected about the project. So with that, we can wrap up the presentation and move on to questions. So if people do have to leave at the hour mark, that's no problem, but we are happy to stay longer and chat until about 12:45 Pacific time. So if that is the case and you have to head out, we just want to say thank you so much for attending this webinar today. We really appreciate you sharing your time with us and participating, and I see there are already some great questions. So our emails are also up here on the screen. As Terri mentioned, she's extremely collaborative and is happy to help if you have more questions, as am I. So both of our emails are there. If you have any questions or comments at all, go ahead and contact us. So we will get started with the first question.
Last, actually, sorry, I'm going to just, if I could just reference one of the comments, Kathy.
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to turn that into a question anyway, so you go ahead.
So Kathy Powelson has correctly said that clinics cannot keep animals because of payment. And so just to clarify what I mean by that is sometimes I've definitely heard of clinics who will keep an animal overnight in the hopes that a person can bring back payment the next, and which sometimes then increases the bill because then they're charged for another night, and not a great practice for sure, but I've definitely heard of that happening.
Mm-hmm.
But Kathy's absolutely right in that you can't be denied your pet because of the payment.
Yeah, she's saying they cannot do that, so it sounds like maybe there are some things going on that shouldn't be happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's good to know.
Good to know. Thank you.
To let your clients know
Yes.
their protection as well.
Yes.
Thank you, Kathy. Okay, so let's get started. I know the first question was, will we receive the PowerPoint presentation afterwards? The answer is yes, we're recording the presentation and we'll send out that, as well as we can send out the PowerPoint presentation as well as the recording. One of the questions is, I'm not sure if you have any information on this, Terri, but it's, do you have any resources regarding animal grief?
Animal grief?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
I think it was asked when we were talking about animal trauma.
Oh, okay. Huh. That's a good question. I know I came across some definitely in the research that I had done. I can't actually quote it on the fly in the moment, but if whoever asked that question would like to get in touch with me, I can certainly give you the resources that I use for the grief portion of the report. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Terri. Okay, and then this is something we've been talking a little bit about in our organization, I know, but one of the questions is, how are the veterinary shortage and current long wait times with vets, which are increased by the pandemic, impacting the ability to grow these programs? And did veterinarians provide their insight on this during the research?
I think, yeah, I think there's definitely, if not a shortage, then certainly I think the veterinary clinics are very busy and overwhelmed. And I think, I'm sure all of you know or have heard that there was the adoption numbers for animals
skyrocketed
like crazy through the pandemic, which of course also means vet visits spike and funding assistance. The need for funding assistance spikes as well. The one thing I guess that I would say as far as structurally vulnerable people in the pandemic, and I know I'm going off topic, I'll come back to it, but the pandemic hasn't necessarily affected a lot of structurally vulnerable people because they receive government funding that has always been in place, and so the pandemic hasn't necessarily affected their funding in any way. They're still getting the same funding they were getting prior to, not more and not less. So, you know, if somebody's on low income or income assistance or PWD or old age security, then nothing's really changed for them. But yes, in terms of, I think there's a greater need for funding assistance programs with the pandemic, and I think what's happening, and Celeste mentioned how busy January has been for the Mcfitty Fund. It's been unreal how busy it's been, and I think that is a culmination of 2020 ending and sort of people getting through that year, starting a new year, and they're still dealing sort of with 2020 in the sense of definitely. Nothing's really changed, right? So, you know, everything's just stretched that much more thinner, and so I think the assistance programs are in greater need than ever right now.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Terri. Okay, so another question, this is a good question, is how did you get the vet clinics to want to help you and provide discounts for the Mcfitty Fund? And do you pay upfront for the costs, and who makes the appointment?
Great questions. I've never had a veterinary clinic say they didn't want to sort of work with Vancouver Humane Society's fund, for sure. So
you reach out to them first?
Yeah, basically what happens is the application comes in. If an applicant already has a clinic that they work with, then we just work with them, with that clinic. And usually the client makes the appointment. Just it's too complicated for me to make the appointment because I don't know the person's schedule.
Yes.
So I ask them to make the appointment and then get back to me and let me know that it's been made. And then I'll contact the vet clinic and let them know we're working with this client. And then we make direct payment to the veterinary clinic once the procedure is complete.
Right. Yeah. Great. Thank you. That's really helpful. So this is another great question that has a couple upvotes. So for sake of time, I'm going to ask this one next. So the question is, without being overly invasive, how do you determine if someone is structurally vulnerable and not someone who's trying to have their vet care paid for, i.e. taking advantage of the program?
I actually have found, I've never ever felt like somebody was trying to just get free vet care. Usually there's a place on the application form to fill out the income, and then if I'm concerned that the person may not qualify, I will ask them to send me a photo of their, you know, ministry slip or right. You know, and if they can't provide it, obviously that tells me something. But for the most part, yeah, I've never run across that. And because it does ask for your income, there's a slot to fill in your income. Most people are super honest, and you know, I've had to call some people and say, unfortunately, your income is higher than what we allow, and they'll go, well, I thought it might be, but I thought it was worth a shot, you know. Yeah. Right. So yeah, I haven't, fortunately, have not come across situations where I feel like somebody's trying to take advantage of the program.
And then with that, Kathy's asking, do you not require proof of income?
We don't require like the piece of paper. Sometimes people send it anyway, but we don't ask for it. I ask a lot of questions sort of that I'm able to assess whether it's true or not. Yeah.
It could certainly be an option though for organizations.
It could be.
If they wanted.
And some people do. Some people offer it and send it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. So another question that has a couple upvotes is if physical access is a barrier for participants to your program, does the program provide support for this, and how?
I'm not sure what physical access. Oh, and I guess I should point out that the whole of the Mcvitty Fund is all done over the phone. There's no in person.
I'm wondering if maybe they mean if like they have difficulty getting to an appointment, like getting to a veterinary clinic. And I will, so physical accessibility to get to the veterinary clinic. I will note that this is actually, I'm not sure if you want to say more about this, Terri, but for another project that I'm working on right now, I've been doing some interviews with folks who have accessed the Mcfitty Fund. And this is something that has come up in nearly every interview I've done. Many people are on disability, and one of the things that they note that has been a barrier and an enhanced barrier during COVID is accessing a veterinary clinic. Oftentimes they don't have a car, and they usually rely on a family member or a friend, but that's made difficult during COVID, being around people. And sometimes it's difficult for them to bring their animal on a bus. And of course, cabs can be expensive depending on how far away the clinic is that they're going. So this is something that definitely, I think, is an area that needs to be addressed. So I just wanted to note that and say that it's definitely something that has come up, and that's kind of on our radar to perhaps add an element into Mcfitty or something like that, to talk with veterinary clinics about options for partnerships or covering cab fare or something like that.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I mean, when I first started, I kind of thought, oh, I wonder if there's an element, of outreach where a person could, pick up a person, take them to the vet and all that. And I think there probably is an element of that. I don't think it wouldn't work with my role, just because there's again, it's a time thing, but I think it's definitely worth looking into, and I have been looking into different potential options of how to help people get to and from, because I've been told by a couple of different clients who use Handy Dart that they're not allowed pets on Handy Dart, even if they're kenneled, even if they're in a little carry thing,
so
which is absurd to me, but that's a whole other webinar.
There's definitely a huge room for improvement and room to look into partnership or something like that, and even talking to Handy Dart, seeing if policies can be changed for those certain situations, something like that. And I think hopefully this research that I'm doing right now, it will definitely indicate that there's a need for some policies to change around that, or partnership with us or with veterinary clinics to find better solutions for that, because like Kathy says, transport is definitely an issue.
It looks like Stephanie's saying telehealth and telemedicine can help. Okay, I'll have to look into that myself. Yeah, that's great.
So another question, this will be quick to answer, is does VHS have an on-site veterinary clinic to provide service, or do they outsource all of the vet care to local clinics?
It's all outsourced, yeah. We don't have a clinic.
We have a little office.
In fact, once in a while I get calls from people saying that they're on their way to bring their dog to see me. I'm like, really? Please don't. But no, we don't have an on-site vet clinic. It's all outsourced. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Okay, so another question is, how do you handle a pet guardian who does not have an existing relationship with any local clinic? We run a very similar program and struggle with convincing a clinic to take on a new client, especially when the clinic knows the client will be on a limited budget.
Okay. I know what I have done before is, I have sometimes called on behalf of the client and sort of talked to them first to ensure that we are working with them, and that we're able to cover a certain amount, and I guess done some negotiating that way. That can sometimes help, that I've found, and I usually too, if I do that, I also ask them questions about why they what their concern is and what do they think is going to happen. And again, sort of trying to start that education of, and to be fair, I fully have, I recognize that sometimes people don't pay their bills, and
Right.
veterinary clinics have to then deal with that. So I do get that. So it's usually it's trying to work with a clinic and come up with what's going to work best for them and the client. And sometimes we haven't been able to reach an agreement, and so I've gone to the client and said, would you be willing to go to a different vet? And then we try a different vet, because sometimes sometimes a no is a no from a clinic, and they just don't want to have to manage the possibility of having to eat the cost, right?
Right. And then another question, Terri, is what is the size of the fund, of the Mcfitty fund?
The size of the fund is, it's annually, it's a match of grants and donations to 50,000 annually.
Right. Great, thank you. And then I think there was one more question that I saw kind of just within the chat. So I'm going to see if I can find that one, and that can be our kind of wrap-up question.
Okay.
Oh, actually, this is kind of just a repeat, actually, I think of another question. It was, where is the veterinary service provided, shelter or private vet practice? So I think there was another question that, oh, there's one more here that popped up. Okay. So where do you apply for the grants?
Oh, that I would have to ask you. I'm not actually sure. I don't have that information with me right now.
Yeah, Amy, our executive director, does most of the grant work. So that's I will write that down though, and Amy could give us a bit of info on that, specifically grants that cover the cost of the Mcfitty fund, and we could send that out with the email with the recording in PowerPoint, because I think that would probably be good information, especially for people in BC, if they're applying for the same grants as us, BC-wide.
Okay. And just as a note, I'll also add that as far as funding assistance programs, there aren't that many in BC for sure. And so the Mcvitty Fund does, even though we're Vancouver Humane Society, we do fund outside of Vancouver, just because there are limited funds available and limited assistance available. And so that's something too. If other BC organizations are interested in starting funds, go for it. Don't assume that we're that we're enough for BC. We fund a lot of the smaller towns and northern areas, and sort of all over the province if there's no other resource. So I think the more programs, the better for everybody.
And Amy just jumped in here, Amy, our executive director. She said the main grantor we work with asks us not to disclose their information, but we have found that in writing grant applications to community organizations, it is important to highlight how the program would support, benefit the person rather than focusing on the animal.
And Kathy Powelson, who's Pause for Hope, states we have received grants from gaming, but most of the funds for Pause for Hope's programs come from individual donations.
Yeah, and we mentioned this, but a lot of our funds also come from individual donations. So the link to our urgent care page, a lot of the funds come from there as well.
Yeah.
And when people go to donate on our website, they can also select to specifically donate to the Mcfitty Fund instead of an overall donation to us. And then there's also the pictures of each animal that they can specifically donate to. So.
Yeah, I mean, ours is broken down now into several sort of subsections, but if you're just starting a program too, it could just be an animal donation program. It wouldn't have to be super specific or, yeah.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions, unless anyone has some last minute ones, but thank you, Terri, for your great answers to all those questions. I hope they were helpful to those who asked. But I think we can wrap up our presentation. Thank you again for everybody who attended, for your great questions, for your comments. Again, our emails are on the screen, and feel free to reach out to either of us about anything from today, to Terri about questions about the Mcfitty Fund, and if you're interested in starting your own, to me about our future research projects. I'm happy to talk about them, and so is Terri. So thank you, everyone. I hope to see you in future webinars, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.